Oh yeah, I got the perfect song for the kids to sing.
And all my people that's drug dealing just to get by. Stack your money till it gets sky high.
Night City is supposedly a city of dreams and ambitions, a place where those with merit and talent steadily rise to the top. A place of hope for those who are willing to work hard and can steady their resolve. This promise is a very obvious falsehood. The city is so stratified that any hope of social mobility is completely impossible unless you want to become some sort of violent lunatic. A place so stagnant and unwelcome that some people completely give up and start jacking off on the sidewalk with their little VR headsets on. Trying to escape the absolutely terrible reality they live in, Night City is plastered in so much metal shine and plastic sheen that sometimes it's actually blinding. The city is more concerned with the appearance of societal success and benevolence than with implementing those two things. The illusion is so powerful that it infects and fools those in power to their own oppression of everyone else as an inevitable force of nature that is completely unquestionable. For those who are oppressed, the illusion is a sedative, instilling a sense of hopelessness and pinning personal failure as the sole reason of poverty. Sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? To compare a piece of cyberpunk media to the current state of the world would be kind of cliche and obvious, but I think there's a point to be made about the vibe of the show, because I think the show captures the kind of common cultural nihilism and cynicism we've developed these last few years. I'll make a comparison that's probably been made a million times at this point already, but have you ever considered that social media is just like cybernetics? Both are vehicles of ideology. Let me throw you a definition here. Ideology is a series of discourses that push false ideas on people. When people buy into these false ideas, they develop a false consciousness about the world, how it works, and their place in it. Well, at least this is the Marxist view. From here you can see why I made my little comparison. In essence, all social media is a set of discourses, which are constructed in a way to promote false conceptions of reality, with the algorithms of these websites set up to produce the most outrageous shit. While looking at cybernetics, the process of delusion and false reality is much more literal. Cybernetics reflect the ideology of Night City. Cybernetics represent the false bootstrap power fantasy. The gun arms, golden hands, and artificial eyes are all this kind of artifice which slowly corrupts your nerve endings, making you drink the proverbial Kool-Aid. So when the power fantasy of ideology clashes with the harsh truth brought onto people by trauma, the result is the mind runs away and shifts reality even further into the delusion of happy memories and nostalgia to cope with the unbearable reality of life. Social media, on the other hand, is a bit more versatile as a tool of ideology, serving as both escapism and controlled spectacle. Escapism with all the parasocial relationships and mindless internet discussion, and spectacle in the form of bad news, scary and upsetting shit, but only presented in a certain way. Spectacle online in the form of upsetting shit that happens as a result of capitalism is always usually framed as a hopeless and an inevitable fact of life. As ironically enough, Cyberpunk Edgerunners and other shit that has this feeling of hopelessness is what sells the best. The result of the trauma of living under late capitalism has short-circuited the brain of the modern person into a hole of either political apathy or extremism, the former being far more common than the latter. So we gravitate towards what we feel, and what we feel is impotence, inability to change anything. With this, we can answer cyberpunk's, as a genre's, most important question: what does it mean to be human? Edgerunner's answer is that none of us are human. Not after the end of history. To be human is to be a historical actor, an agent of our own interests and beliefs, not cogs with predictable trajectory, and destination. David is not human, for he is incapable of escaping.
I be flying high, shorty, I be flying high. I be flying high, shorty, I be flying high. I be flying high, shorty, I be flying high. If you ain't up on my level, just sit here, please don't reply. Bye. I be flying high,
What does it even mean to be a cyberpunk? Well, what does it mean to be punk? As long as there have been punks, there have been posers who don't get it. Because punk is more than musical style and aptitude towards flashy hair and fishnets. Punk is an attitude. It's about rebellion, anger, and frustration. It's about sticking it to the man. In his video about Edgerunners, Jeff through a mother's basement points out what makes the show so punk is the futility of their struggle. He doesn't make this observation, but I think this admission of impossibility is subconsciously part of all punk culture. The edge and angst of punk, which later would evolve into emo, is the result of this subconscious knowledge. They rebel not out of belief in their cause, but instead of cynical brattiness, pissing on the fire rather than getting a hose. To be a punk is to be lost in the world, miserable but not dead. Bit of a left turn, but let's talk about Hegel. In his book, Otaku's Japan's Database Annuals, Hiroki Ozuma describes the result of postmodernity on Japanese society, citing Alexander Kojève and his observations on the Hegelian concept of the end of history and how it mapped onto the culture of Japan. Kojève observed two possible outcomes for humanity at the end of history: a return to animality or the development of snobbery. The end of history for Hegel meant the end of humanity's struggle with nature, signaling a return of animality, where humans go back to the simple pleasure-seeking and fulfillment of their most basic needs, in harmony with nature. But Kojève observed something else within Japan, a society which had gone through centuries of isolation and enforced peace, artificially inducing the supposed end of history. But instead of devolving into the American style of consumerist bliss and commercialist nihilism, Japan had adopted what Kojève called snobbery, which he demonstrates with the phenomenon of seppuku as a denial of man's natural tendency to avoid death. Even if there is no chance whatsoever for denial, snobs presume to deny, to manufacture formal opposition, and to love the thrill of opposing nature. The example Kojève gives is ritual suicide, seppuku. In ritual suicide, in spite of having no reason to die, suicide is committed in essence because of the formal values of honor and order. This is the ultimate snobbery. This way of life is not animalistic in that there are moments of negation. However, this also differs from the human way in the historical age. For the nature of snobs and their oppositional stance, for instance, the opposition to instinct at the time of ritual, would no longer move history in any sense. No matter how many sacrificial corpses are piled up, ritual suicide, which is purely and courteously executed, certainly would not be a motivating force for revolution. This is the attitude of punk. To not live comfortable lives, but rather to commit themselves to a set of values of conduct, an active denial of all incentive structures. It can provide resistance and friction, but never be able to muster any kind of functioning alternative. So, to return to the question of what does it mean to be a cyberpunk, to be a cyberpunk is the same. Edgerunners put up the same performance of meaningless resistance by taking the hard road in life. Even through kissing ass and working, the menial labor drudgery of life would be far easier. No matter how many punks die in the dirty work and espionage that defines their life, it means nothing. Their defiance is to the corpos in front of them, not the ones which pay them to defy the others. They conduct themselves with a general mistrust of corporations and this kind of special social convention, but in reality, they can't deny their environment. You're bound to be used no matter who you are. You want to see how to actually pronounce the guy's name? Here you go.
Alexandre Kojève.
The crew takes on a job from Faraday, this guy, to retrieve information on a nebulous something from some corporate executive. David was the sewer punk at school who sold pornos, so of course he intimately knows the sexual consumption habits of his bully's dad. The suit in question apparently has a taste for highly violent brain dances from a guy named Jimmy Kurosaki, which David is intimately familiar with as an avid enjoyer of Jimmy's work himself. The crew attempt to capture Jimmy, but he's able to escape with David in hand, putting him into the brain dance he views at the start of the show, but replacing the giant jacked John Norris with the skinny David, putting him into the horrifying reality of cyberpsychosis. The rest of the crew starts scrapping a bunch of drones and hold Jimmy up at gunpoint, freeing David and setting up a little ambush on the corpo. While keeping an eye on him, David and Jimmy talk. Jimmy predicts that he too will end up in the annals of crazy motherfuckers who took it too far and went psycho, as he has the same Sandevistan as John Norris, bound to share the same ugly, ugly fate. The target arrives and needs to be stalled out by Jimmy with some clever speechcraft, while the gang makes sure they block all his avenues of escape and communication. Then they spring on him. In the ensuing crazy-ass gunfight, Jimmy gets hit by a stray projectile and just gets fucking gutted, dying a croaking, pathetic rat on the floor of his own warehouse. But with his last few breaths, he leaves David with a smile to remember. Jimmy's brain dances in the world of cyberpunk are a kind of simulacra for cyberpsychosis. It presents an easy way for the ideology of cyberpunk's world to sedate any kind of critical thinking. Interpassivity describes the phenomena of having any external force performing our passive internal emotions, so that we don't have to act on them as the emotional need is satisfied, even if nothing has changed in reality. In his book, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative?, Mark Fischer uses WALL-E as an example of interpassivity. With its extremely anti-capitalist and anti-corporate message, seems like the perfect tool to agitate the audience. But as he describes it, the film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. The role of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something in the way that propaganda does, but to conceal the fact that the operations of capital do not depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. WALL-E represents this kind of neutered corporate anti-corporatism, which on the superficial level provides us with all the symptoms of capitalism, but does not provide any actual analysis of why capitalism is so prone to these types of catastrophes and why it's bad. The end of the movie gives us a view of a mildly altered status quo, with the humans returning to Earth and planting the last plant back in the ground, implying the eventual return of what once was. Consider the rest of the movie as well, turning the captain and the consumers on the ship as infantile pets, free of moral responsibility, under the thumb of the malevolent Otto. WALL-E gives us a simulacra of the climate crisis, saying that it is ultimately the fault of bad people in charge, and once we oust them, life will be a paradise. The system is not flawed, the people are. Jimmy's brain dances serve much the same purpose. They present to us an interpassive way of venting our anger against the corporate machine and the system as a whole, but it also puts us into the clear bad guy seat, turning all who oppose the system to be a psycho and mass murderers. All of them end in the same way as well, with them all dying, showing the inevitable failure of resistance. The resistance being offered is that of unbridled and unfocused rage, rather than from a stance of real critique, because critique doesn't sell. Hyperviolent interpassive catharsis does. They bring the suit back to home base, preparing to have Kiwi crack the data out of him, but Maine starts to act up. The amount of chrome entering his body slowly disintegrates his personality, violently pulling Kiwi out of her netrun. Dorio pleads with him to stop jamming metal into himself and to downgrade his gear so he can start recovering. He refuses outright and runs away to go brood away from the others while slowly disassociating from reality. David tries to come and snap him out of it, but instead, just like Dorio, he gets coldly pushed away. So he helps Lucy set up for her dive into the Corpo's head. While in her dive, he wakes up, begging and groveling at David to let him free, promising him a future at Arasaka. David says he would never give up his gang so easily, while the exec Tanaka replies,
"Foolish boy, can you not see that they're using you as their tool?
Mean to say, Arasaka won't?
You are blind. Still don't get it? Who do you think paid to make this little stunt of yours possible? It reeks of Militech. All roads lead to the Megacorps. No matter how high you rise or believe you can, you will never escape our shadow."
But that's...
Then after a few quiet minutes, the fucker croaks it, along with the crew's jammer leaving to bear the full force of Trauma Team. David runs faster than he ever ran, carrying Lucy on his back, putting her in the car. He takes a second to breathe, and then runs all the way back out of loyalty to Maine. But by then, it was too late. Far too late. The cops combined with Max Tack had driven Maine into full cyberpsychosis, killing Dorio. When David gets to talk to him, he comes back to reality for a second, washed by a sobering wave of guilt and pain. Maine, in his last moments, would tell David the one piece of advice he should have taken. Run.
I can hold my liquor, but this man can't handle his weed. Dark in the morning now, on Chicago south of town. I'm on the Indiana. I heard it in the radio now.
The end was nearing for David. His last job. He would be given a fortune to do what he does best. Run at the problem head on and fucking blow it up. Rebecca is concerned about his chrome to human body mass ratio and the amount of drugs he has to pump to keep himself from breaking down. David reassures her that he'll all be fine and he promises to limit his use of the Sandevistan. Watching the convoy pass by, the crew has to put away all their reservations, and Falco prepares to punch the gas. There's this whole big fight. David pulls a fighting game finisher move on two guys in a van while breaking his promise to Rebecca to cut down on the Sandevistan. After a long chase in the sand, they realize the big truck they were tailing, with the supposed cargo, had no driver and was set up to fall off a cliff. David goes back into bullet time to swing the car harpoon all the way around a big fucking boulder. The short silence they're afforded after stopping the truck is interrupted by a convoy of Militech missile launchers and tanks. All come to annihilate either the gang or the cargo or both. David gets a call from Lucy telling him to put on the beast. The cyberskeleton. The cargo. Let the metal take him. It's his only chance of survival. The crew's only chance. He has to take it. Rebecca screams at him, telling him that this is going to drive him over the edge, that he's drinking his own Kool-Aid. He's not special. He too, like Norris, like Jimmy, like her brother, is not immune to Night City and is not special. Like every other fool who made themselves more metal than man, he would just become another slave to the machine he once fought so hard to run from. David hops in anyway, receiving another call from Lucy. It had all been a ploy, a trap by that bastard Faraday, who, like everybody else in the city, was just another opportunistic crony. Apparently, Kiwi had turned coats. Faraday had promised a big amount of cash for her if she could lead the crew into the trap, and more importantly, kidnap and incapacitate Lucy beforehand, leaving her with Faraday and his weird little goon squad to use as a manipulation tool. A break in the barrage signaling her escape, she zaps Falco in the neck for good measure. Once it is finished installing, David starts to level the Militech battalion, crushing trucks and tanks using the most almost incomprehensible power of the cyberskeleton, phasing in and out of the edge of reality. Every moment where it seems David might have fully lost it, he's pumped with even more drugs, skirting the delicate line between delusion and sanity, running on a knife's edge. Effectively murderizing the entire Militech force, he sets his sights on what he sought out to climb from the very beginning, Arasaka Tower, a representation of David's angers and frustrations, but also ambitions. Falco and Rebecca entertain his final wishes by taking him to the skyscraper, of course not without resistance from Arasaka. On the ride, David has the last memory of his mother he'd ever think about. He tells her he'll make it to the top of that bloody tower, no matter what it took. He made good on that promise. Then after mowing down another 100 goons and getting kicked out of the side of the building, it seems he's lost it, gone full psycho. And true love's kiss wakes him from his delusion, from his deteriorating mind. This was never enough, and it would never be enough. Rebecca is blown to bits, and so is his own brain. In his encounter with the infamous Atom Smasher, a representation of what he was, at least in his own head, though he was fighting against the tyranny of the megacorps and the slow corporate drudgery of that kind of life. Let me ask you a question. Did he really? Was he ever working free and against the interests of the megacorporations? Did he ever have the agency to leave and to do as he pleased? To have the retirement so deserved for so-called legends? Maybe our boy wasn't so special. Maybe he too was just another cog, a wheel to be turned. The dream of his mother really was fulfilled at the end. He was able to reach the tippy top and became a real legend. But it feels so wrong. At the end, we don't feel like David had won. He's merely done what he's been told. A fake resistance, an inability to see reality, the world clouded, never breaking the illusion, the mirage of Night City. He also fell into that same hole of thinking. He can never leave its walls, maybe not physically, as no one stops him on the city limits, but mentally. He is stuck in Night City. We see him and Lucy and the crew outside all the time, but never do they consider just running away. Never can they learn to cut their losses and stop their pursuit of this self-sacrificial conception of glory. They can never get the retirements they want. In their final moments they realize what they had missed. Where does the dream end? Where does life begin? Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative, is a book about capitalist realism. Well, no shit, but what is capitalist realism? Well, the name capitalist realism is a play on socialist realism, which was an artistic movement among Soviet artists, which in 1934 became the official policy of the party, censoring the art of many. The characteristics of socialist realism is this utopian proletarian art, portraying a kind of futuristic fantasy of life within the Soviet Union, serving as propaganda. Capitalist realism, as described by a quote attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. It is more broad than an entirely artistic movement. Rather, as Mark Fischer describes, it is more like a pervasive atmosphere, conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier, constraining thought and action. Capitalist realism is an ideology which hides itself into becoming non-ideological because the clause of its ideology is that it is not. Capitalism has become reality, the non-ideological inevitability of the world, the end of history. It is the ultimate unconscious assumption that, well, what other options do we have? Thus, the art and attitudes created as products of capitalist realism are either bootlicking optimism or, the more interesting part of the equation, a nihilistic grimness saddled with a directionless frustration pointed at general authority that might seem to be opposed to capitalism at first look. An example the book points out is Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. In his dreadful lassitude and objectless rage, Cobain seemed to give weary voice to the despondency of the generation that had come after history, whose every move was anticipated, tracked, bought, and sold before it had ever even happened. Cobain knew that he was just another piece of spectacle, and nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV. Knew that his every move was a cliché, scripted in advance. Knew that even realizing it as a cliché. The impasse that paralyzed Cobain is precisely the one that Jameson described. Like postmodern culture in general, Cobain found himself in a world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible, where all that is left is to imitate dead styles, to speak through the masks and with the voices of the styles in the imaginary museum. Here, even success meant failure, since to succeed would only mean that you were the new meat on which the system could feed. This is very much the same as the classic Che Guevara t-shirt dilemma. Should you buy the t-shirt as in support of the face of the shirt, or should you not buy the shirt to prevent yourself from supporting the corporation you probably forced some Bangladeshi children to make it? The capitalist realism angle on this question is that it doesn't matter whether you buy one or not. It won't make a difference on whether Western corporations will exploit Bangladeshi children. So, why deprive yourself of a t-shirt? Is it morally okay to do so because you understand and therefore disavow the exploitation of the Bangladeshi children? You're bathing yourself in a layer of ironic and cynical distance to keep yourself from feeling guilty. So when we show off our anti-authoritarianism to the world with our newfangled shirt, you can act with impunity. You can do all the conspicuous consumption you want because you have, on an intellectual level, you've already separated yourself from it. Therefore, challenging the status quo doesn't matter because you've already acted your resistance out within your own head. The point is that you can only uphold the status quo of capitalism by first disavowing it. This is an idea coined by Slavoj Žižek in his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology. This is present in the character of David, with all the corporate crime shit. Working for the system he and his crew have been antagonized by. David understands, at least on some level, that murdering innocent or low-level goons is probably not the most morally righteous thing to do, but he has already disavowed the system. He's not a suit, he's not the CEO opening sweatshops in Bangladesh, so he gets to think of himself as the countercultural rebel and his gang, a crew working against corporate power, while actively serving the interests of a corporation. Killing is bad, corporations are bad, but what else is a thug to do? David and his crew have grown up in a world after the proverbial end of history. Much like a young Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, They found themselves in an unsolvable dilemma. They found themselves in a world where reality had been subsumed and incorporated by capitalism, and this means they're incapable of imagining any other social existence outside of it, as their understanding of the world is determined by those who keep them in their poverty, as Mark Fischer describes. Accordingly, neoliberalism has sought to eliminate the very category of value in the ethical sense. Over the past 30 years, capitalist realism has successfully installed business ontology, in which it is simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. The inhabitants can describe what is wrong, whether it be the lack of healthcare, public sanitation, suitable housing, or any kind of public infrastructure. They can see that the slave wages they work for are bad and they need more things to live, but they cannot give any valid reason why they deserve to live, or an alternative to the system of their oppression. Life's only meaning, the only way they can view the world, is to treat everything as a commodity, a cycle of consumption and depression. Night City is a world entirely constructed by the social conditions it exists in. Nothing is left of the natural world within the city. Power fantasies are built on the seeming ease at which one can acquire this power. Cybernetics represent the ideology of Night City, manifested into tangible form, turning the world into forms of raw data, lacking all form of human interpretation, disregarding the metaphysics of yore. Everything can be measured, and scientific measurement and calculation are the only valid ways of viewing the world. The power fantasy of cybernetic enhancements is, of course, a lie. The shitty gloominess of Night City is because it lacks shiny things, but when you install them, you feel as if you're included in the elite, that the lights belong to you. The tangible power you get from them is a secondary function. They are the myth of social mobility, a false belief in individualism, of me against the world, and a false hope of overcoming the incalculably improbable odds of striking gold and making it. This is where Maine dies from, and much the same with David. I'm special and different and will make it to the top. This lie is told to them from the second they are born, as the past has been successfully sterilized and erased from contemporary memory, and with this nihilistic attitude about the unchanging nature of the socio-economic paradigm. An example of this within Edgerunners is David's mom. You guys remember the nice, heartwarming speech by David's mom before she dies.
You know, I've been thinking lately.
About what?
Maybe I drop out. Find some work or whatever.
Do you hear yourself?
Come on, seriously, you know we can't afford those repairs. Plus, you got no idea just how bad I stand out compared to all of them. Anyone besides a true blue corpo gets shit on. Even if I do graduate, they'll never accept me. No kid from Santa will ever be a suit. Don't want to be one anyway.
So you tell me, what have I been busting my ass for then, huh? Everything I do for you, D. Don't you see that? You're breaking my heart, mijo.
Wait, what?
My sweet baby boy. So smart, so talented, you're everything to me. I want to give you a fighting chance in this city and a good education. It's why I put in all of those hours. Why I'm never home.
I'm sorry. Shouldn't have brought it up. Don't cry, Mom.
Think I don't know how they treat you? Think I don't get treated the same way? But that's why you gotta prove them wrong. You have to work hard and rise through the ranks. My son at Arasaka Tower, top floor, I can just see it. You've got this, D. You're my son.
Yeah, well, easier said than done.
Now pay attention to this sentence.
Think I don't know how they treat you? Think I don't get treated the same way? But that's why you gotta prove them wrong. You have to work hard and rise through the ranks. My son at Arasaka Tower, top floor, I can just see it. You've got this, D. You're my son.
Yeah, well, easier said than done.
On one hand, David's mom acknowledges the shittiness not only of snooty private school kids, but also the inherent injustice of the system both of them live in. She realizes the city is a bad place to be, but on the other hand, she points up, not away from the city. There is no escape, at least in her mind, so instead of reaching for a way out, so the only way to make life bearable is to climb up. So her message to David is one about obedience, if nothing else. He's a smart and talented kid, so he has to stay put so that the resource that is his personhood can be extracted painlessly, and he can reap the meager benefits of living the frivolous life of a salaryman, i.e., financial stability and longevity. Nothing will stop Night City from being the miserable shithole it is, because it wouldn't be Night City anymore. His mother's dream of reaching the top of Arasaka Tower is fulfilled in the end. Maybe not by the exact same process, but both paths are in essence similar to each other, as both seek that same impossible goal: contentment under capitalism. Escape from something inescapable. So when we reach the end of the show, we see the edge of reality. That's what the good doctor meant by falling off the edge, shoving past the illusion of capitalist realism only to see a black nihilism, an endless void. Lucy's and David's relationship illustrates something extremely tragic about capitalist realism. Lucy's past is pretty fucking terrible, being the subject of corporate experiments created to navigate the rubble of the old internet, to find the purpose of Arasaka as a corporation, to find the original directive. Digging through the ruins of the old world haunted by its horrors and demons, rogue AIs and other such ghosts of that bygone time, many of the kids dying in the process. After a while, all the kids who didn't get their brains fried try to run away as they realize the difference between death to a bullet and death to computer virus was minimal. And with the former, they were at least free for the moments before death, scarred permanently and tied to her past. We learned in episode 2 that it's a dream of hers to go to the moon. From David, we learned that within the cyberpunk universe, the moon was essentially a glorified space gulag built to dig ore out of its surface after the natural resources of Earth were destroyed. We can compare here the moon to what Foucault would describe as a society of discipline, the modernist approach to enforce the law and to keep the underclass under control, with guns, tear gas, and blockades, using force to create compliance with direct commands, imperative orders with no room for lax. Lucy's dream of going to the moon can be interpreted, of course, not as a desire to be disciplined, to return to a society before postmodernism twisted itself onto the image of capitalism, before capitalist realism. She wants to return to the days when resistance to capitalism was simpler, a return to modernism and meaning, truth and stability, the return of a grand narrative. What she found in the remains before the data crash was the possibility of a future, maybe not directly in the ruined code, but in the contemplation and separation from the rest of society, existing within that society of discipline, She saw a world where resistance against such discipline is as simple as running away. David's environment, however, is something completely different. Night City doesn't brutally punish dissidents with hard labor or police. Actually, the police presence is pathetic compared to the amount of punks with chrome for brains. Only the most dangerous are neutralized, while the others are actually rewarded by the corpos by doing their violence in the direction away from whoever they got hired by. Night City, unlike the Moon, is what Deleuze would call a society of control. Societies of control act very different. Instead of giving clear directives on what to do, instead putting sedatives in your face in the form of newfangled super drugs, VR porn, or shiny new metal toys. Instead of giving something definite for you to resist against, there is just this general dissatisfaction with life itself, which is perfect for the subliminal propaganda that is advertisements. David doesn't know how to want anything that isn't material or tangible for the materialist world of commodity he grew up in. Sentimentality can only ever be on an unconscious level, as love is something that doesn't really mesh with societies of control. A form of happiness outside of pleasure. Love shouldn't exist within the ideology of capitalist realism, as it fills the supposedly unfillable hole of meaning that should have been replaced by the cold emptiness of the endless void. This is why David is able to leave cyberpsychosis for those few brief moments before he dies. Because for a second, the ideology, the grimness, and the nihilism of it all gets whisked away in the winds of love. Lucy is the only one that can get him out because she gives David's life supreme purpose and takes him out of the meaningless wasteland that is the rest of his life. She gives a dream to follow, a grand narrative of modernist idealism, the spark of hope in his cold, cold heart. Ultimately, though, he misinterprets Lucy's dream, a dream of real change, of real freedom, as one of accumulating enough cash to take a trip to the moon. The idealism of it all is lost in translation. These two people exist from two different eras, so on a romantic talk outside the city, it's lost on David that he's got a chance to get a retirement no other punk has ever gotten. If he were to just never come back, he would to get to love Lucy until both of them got old, to see a happiness and joy that the power fantasy of brain dances or actual cybernetics could ever give him. A true fulfillment, but the grip of the city is too strong, the barrier of understanding too wide. David can't leave. Without the city, without the cybernetics, he's nothing. Not realizing the job, Faraday and Arasaka, these things are all ultimately illusory. He's not responsible for shit. He owes them nothing. That he and Lucy deserve the life promised on that poster far away from it all, away from the cage of light. But that cage is all David has. It's all he knows and all he will ever know. Much like the man in Plato's cave, the shadows to him are more meaningful than any real thing, as all his life he's only seen shadows. David, and by extension all of us, live at the end of history. A world built on the corpse of Hegel's rotting dialectics. Neither Lucy or David could really understand what they wanted, as what they wanted doesn't exist. Neither have a frame of reference for historical, political, economic, or cultural consciousness. It's impossible, as both are postmodern beings, too young for the ghost of history to haunt them with terrible purpose and meaning, born into a dead world, where all that has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Within the purview of Alexandra Kojève, David and Lucy would not be human. Homo sapiens most certainly, but human, no. They are snobs, both of them. They negate meaninglessness with a half-hearted attempt at escape. There is no denying the system, for the system is reality. Reach the end of reality, there is nothing for you. The cold deadness of space, not the shining moon or the earth. I think as a leftist, you need to certainly hold back your expectations of online media criticism, as not everyone is a communist, sadly. It's kind of unfair to expect a thorough anti-capitalist analysis from anime video essayists. I mean, people like that do exist. Look at someone like Solari, but in general, they're hard to come by. I think as anime seems separated from the Western culture war of North America and Europe, though it isn't, we in the West overlook some of the politically charged messages of anime or the possible implications. Let's talk about capitalist realism in online media criticism and political literacy. This Reddit post inspired me to make this video. Or more accurately, the screenshot of a YouTube comment which the Reddit post is about. The worst part of the dystopia is the sheer hopelessness we feel at each corner of the society. It could have been a cheap and lazily done critique of late-stage capitalism, like every other Western dystopia in video games and entertainment. Instead, tosses all of that out and basically tells you it's pretty pointless to question the capitalism or the corporations. A character in the video game says a line that hits pretty hard. You people love to criticize us, but you offer no alternative. That's a genuine death nail in almost every champagne critique that Hollywood could churn out. I think that made Edgerunners so good was that it told a love story amidst all the scum, drugs, sex, and utter hopelessness of a corporate-run city, and it didn't do it to try and deliver some kind of stupid message. Even though it's pointless to try and change the system, it's still worth it to make a name for yourself and die for a dream. What I'm interested in here is the commenter is tired of champagne critique, which implies the existence of valid criticism of late-stage capitalism. Then he veers away from this attitude, calling the possibility of that legitimate anti-capitalist message stupid. He also does a misreading of the show. No one in the anime ever thinks about changing the system, as though they might question the system. They can never get at the inherent structural contradictions of capitalism. The specific tragedy is the lack of change, the lack of action taken, and the lack of thought. Instead, saying that the show praises individualism and that making a name for yourself is the thesis of a show where the main character dies in the most frivolous death right after most of his buddies are killed. This is one of the last mental defense mechanisms that capitalist realism has in its sleeve. Mark Fischer calls this reflexive impotence. Among capitalism's victims, the goal is not to act out positive change, but rather to postpone possible pain, to mitigate as much as possible with endless hedonic pleasure seeking, as they know this is the way things are and will always be, and that nothing can change that. You people love to criticize, but you offer no alternative. As a line makes me so angry, as, a communist. But it fits the frame of capitalist realism very well. The acknowledgement of alternatives is either impossible or uncomfortable. Either way, it's undesired. As Fischer references French thinker Alain Badiou. We live in a state of contradiction, a brutal state of affairs, profoundly inegalitarian, where all existence is evaluated in terms of money alone, is presented to us as ideal. To justify their conservatism, the partisans of the established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful, so instead they have to decide to say that all the rest is horrible. Sure, they say, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky that we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats like they do in Rwanda, etc. Just as an addendum, right? I'm not calling this specific YouTube commenter stupid or brainwashed or a sheeple, right? He has a lot of valid points. I get where he's coming from, right? I also don't like Hollywood trying to trick us into thinking it's anti-capitalist. But this is all part of the point, right? Capitalist realism, in our closest moments to reaching the truth about capitalism and class relations, it cuts us off. And that's what happens to this guy, right? He's very close to understanding what the show actually meant. That capitalism has so successfully consumed our collective psyches that it's been able to trick us into thinking there is no alternative. It's tragic. There's no victory in it. Alright, you can continue with the video now. As a final observation of this chapter, we're going to go extra meta. Cyberpunk as a genre is a product of capitalist realism. Coincidentally, I found a Reddit post making the same observation while doing research for this topic, so I'm going to use this post to sum up my thoughts.
Instead, I find cyberpunk as a genre to be so compelling as an excellent example of this idea. The genre's boom in popularity I think has to do with the fact that many people, regardless of whether they have read Fischer's theory or not, understand the implications of capitalist realism. Cyberpunk captures our imagination because it's bleak futurism. Compared to other parts of the sci-fi genre, there is no utopian imagery or society. There's not even the vaguely elitist, anti-authoritarian, and soft anti-communist tone as earlier dystopian genres. Nor is there even a promise of an escape to the stars. Instead, our imagined future in cyberpunk is often one with realities that mirror our own corporate triumph over the state, weakening the rights and autonomy in the name of increased profits, mass security, and a decline of living standards and expansion of inequality that produces desperation.
Cyberpunk offers no alternatives to capitalism. Instead, the punk, in its name, offers a more primal form of resistance, raw destruction and often recklessness, leading to death as the ultimate form of protest. Cyberpunk fiction also emphasizes the isolation and loneliness we face in an increasingly inhuman, algorithmic world. In cyberpunk, the consumerist and individualistic society has no cures, but a common theme is highlighting the fragile but all too important friend and found family connections we attempt to forge and maintain. I think if I had to write a definitive thesis for the video, it would be something like, Cyberpunk Edgerunners is an anime about capitalist realism and its consequences upon modern society, both in a textual and metatextual way. In the text, it describes the socio-economic paradigm of neoliberal capitalism after Reagan, along with the psychological phenomenon which define capitalist realism, both with the way it presents the universe and its characters. With the name of the show being called Edgerunners, skirting the line of capitalist reality, but never being able to make it outside until the tragic end, where David falls off the face of the world, knowing the truth, but not being able to do anything with it, in a metatextual way, in the sense that it exists within a genre which is unconscious of its own role within capitalist realism. The discourse surrounding it also serves as another example of capitalist realism, while answering cyberpunk's most old and important question of what does it mean to be human, with the bleak answer of no one is. We have lost the meaning of that word a long time ago.
All's my life I has to fight, nigga. All's my life hard times like, yeah. Bad trips like, yeah. Nazareth, I'm fucked up, homie, you fucked up. But if God got us, then we gon' be alright. Nigga, we gon' be alright.
I know this video has been going on for a bit too long and a bit too depressingly, so let me give you some hope for the future. In the book, Fischer gives us a solution. Chapter 9, Marxist Super Nanny. Fischer says that the first step in dismantling capitalist realism, we need to reconstruct the idea of a general will. Maybe not consistent consciousness, but rather a set of common interests and movements. We can't just point out the issues of capitalism, as that only strengthens capitalist realism. We need to form the new left around something long lost to the people of the world: hope. We've landed on the ideological equivalent of ground zero. We can only build up from here. We need to consider our movement post-capitalist, rather than a return to a good time before capitalism, as if we did, the new left would relive the mistakes of the idealistic past. The rise in mental health disorders and climate crisis all represent the real, something a bit outside of reality. We must have people realize that these things exist in connection to capital, not just facts of reality. If we can do this, if we can offer an alternative, people will start latching on because we have something real compared to the fake, plastic reality of capitalist realism. One last quote. The long, dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again.